Okay, so this is the social construction of sex, part two. So when I left off, I was talking about the patriarchal model of sex, which is, like I said, what most of us were taught and how most people actually still conceptualize sex, right, as being kind of unequal and this idea of it being unilateral. Now, when you think about how this plays out, then, and this idea of girls, then this idea of sex is something where you actually have these words, and you think about this idea of virginity and of purity. And when you talk about girls then losing their virginity, sacrificing their virginity, that someone takes their virginity, right? It is this idea that somehow a woman loses in this equation. So on slide 9, then, I actually talk about the feminist model of sex. Now, you could probably guess from all my talk about feminism throughout the semester that one of the things that is involved when you actually conceptualize sex from a feminist model, the first is the idea that there is no hierarchy. It is not unilateral, that it is actually supposed to be reciprocal. Because if you conceptualize sex with two people, it would make sense that, well, both people are actively involved. So instead of having an active person and a passive person, then it would be an active person and an active person, right? So this idea that there is mutuality and that it is not actually unilateral. The second thing is that when sex is discussed in kind of public and official ways, that when you look at this idea of sex ed, I think girls only get the message that sex is bad. That is, you could get pregnant, you could get an STD, and the third part is it's bad because people could call you a slut, that you'll get a bad reputation, that everyone will think that you are easy, right? Kind of make this argument that if we actually taught that pleasure was supposed to be involved with everyone who it has sex, it would actually kind of be a revolution of sorts, right? Because what happens if you teach girls, well, it's not that someone's taking something from you or that you are giving up something, but instead that if you are going to have sex, then you should get something out of it. You should enjoy yourself, right? You should definitely then have pleasure from the experience. That if we go into that like teaching sex with that type of mindset, I think it would actually change the rates of sexual assault, because it would no longer be this idea where girls are taught, well, you just have to resist, right? You have to resist, that there is nothing in it for you. If you actually teach women and girls, there is something in it for you. So I asked then, what were the messages that you received from your parents and schools? Did your parents ever talk about sex with you? Because what I'm finding when I talk to students nowadays is that in a lot of cases, because there is the internet, parents don't ever talk about it with their kids whatsoever, assuming that they are going to learn from some other source. The other thing is, well, then what age were you taught sex ed in schools? I know that in a lot of cases, then it is, I think in New York State, the 7th grade and 10th grade. And it's always an interesting conversation in class to hear then what everyone then has experienced in terms of their sex ed. So what I tell people is that, okay, so I gave this patriarchal model, I gave this feminist model. It is hard for us to understand, well, okay, sex is socially constructed, and what I give in terms of that is that our norms, what we think of as sexual norms, have changed drastically throughout time, throughout cultures, and then through each situation. So on slide 10, I give 3 examples then when it comes to variations in sex, which is not what it sounds like. So variations in sex and how we actually think of sex and how we actually then, as a culture, prescribe behavior. And so the historical one I actually give, and I actually talk about my own childhood, which was not that long ago. But I will say it was in Texas. It was in the Bible Belt. It was more conservative in Texas at the time than I think New York State was at all, right? Or California. We won't even compare Texas norms and California norms. But when I was a teenager, people still referred to this baseball analogy, right? That is comparing sex to baseball. Now, what happens with this analogy is that there are some things that are implicit in it. The first is that, well, it is prescribing what is appropriate in terms of sex acts. The second is, well, you are looking at a couple that is courting, that has a dating relationship, that it is something that happens over a extended period of time, and it is gradual and builds on each other. Why does this matter? Because the assumption back then is that, well, first you meet somebody, then you ask them out on a date and go out to dinner and talk, and then the sex stuff comes after. And it doesn't all happen on the same day. It actually happens over a period of time. And it is very much set up so that it is like a baseball game in that you win and lose. And in this case, then, you can argue that all the winning then is done in a heterosexual model by the guy, whereas the woman's job then is actually to kind of push back and either say yes or no in this situation. The assumption, once again, in a patriarchal model is that there's one person who is gaining and one person who is losing over this. So if you don't know this baseball analogy, I actually explain it this way, and I'll actually explain it the way we referred to it back when I was in high school, that in a very conservative Christian household. The first step was, first base is kissing, second base then hands above the waist, and once again it's a goal for the guys, right, because it makes more sense that way. Third then is hands below the waist, and then a home run or a score then is having vaginal intercourse. Okay, what does that show? That it is a progression of time that is prescribed, that we actually thought of sex as something that should build up, that in a lot of cases, and for, you know, in my case, it was just pretty much, okay, home run, that's after you get married. That is in the privacy of your own married relationship. You don't really talk about it elsewise. What's happened over time is that whole model has kind of eroded because I think no longer does America conceptualize sex in a strictly heterosexist model. And sexual norms have changed completely, right? Because, there's Tinder, Grindr, etc. And a lot of times what happens are the sex acts actually occur at the beginning of the relationship, right? You don't necessarily have any compatibility except for what you've exchanged kind of superficially via text. You have sex, and then I think afterwards then people decide, okay, are we compatible? Do we actually like to talk to each other, etc.? So you have a flip around of this understanding. Even the ways that we talked about sex went from being euphemistic, where you didn't actually say what was happening because it wasn't proper or polite, and you just use these other terms, right? Home run, score. In fact, I think when I was a teenager, everyone said doing it, right? Rather than actually saying the word sex, it was doing it. And now we kind of moved away from euphemisms altogether, and I find that young people actually speak fairly frankly about sex. Okay. That with cultural, I actually talk about, and this is my foray into anthropology. During Deviance, I bring in the world of social psychology. This is where I talk about anthropology. And this is the Jarai tribe of Indonesia and an anthropologist named Hallowell. Now, Hallowell was an anthropologist who basically hung out with the Durai tribe doing her research. And the Durai tribe was gender segregated, where the women actually worked together, basically doing kind of the cooking and all that type of stuff, while the guys then were in separate quarters. So gender segregated work. Hallowell went to one morning, went in to talk to the different women, and they were out there kind of laughing and goofing off, and she asked them, what is so funny? At that point, then someone said, this guy actually tried to come in to my home night before, and he was totally drunk, and he tried to have sex with me, and I had to chase him out and basically yell at him, and all the other women were laughing about how funny the situation was. Now, Hallowell actually said, no, that's why is that funny? It's dangerous, it's horrible, we need to actually do something about it, stop it, etc. And instead, they actually said, why is this dangerous? And in fact, what they said became the title of her work, and they said, why is it dangerous? It's only a penis, right? So, of course, that raised a whole nother set of issues when it came to her research, and Hallowell wanted to find out, well, why would they say it's only a penis? Because in the Western understanding, then, rape is actually something that we kind of assume in a lot of cases. The Durai tribe actually conceptualized genitalia differently than we do. That is, of course, anyone can observe that male genitalia is on the outside and women's genitalia are on the inside. But with the Durai tribe, how they conceptualized this was, okay, because men's genitalia is on the outside, it's actually more vulnerable, it's more exposed. Women then are protected because it's inside the body. Now, I think the way to explain this the best is that in self-defense classes, if you are a woman, a lot of times they say, well, if you really need to get away from a guy, then knee him in the crotch, right? Basically punch him where it hurts, because male external genitalia is very vulnerable when it comes to pain. Because the Durai tribe actually defined it in this way, there was actually a very different understanding in how sex was conceptualized. This idea then that men did not have power in this situation. And like I said, all the women actually were laughing because they thought it was a funny situation. So with situational variation, we are looking at this idea of who it is and what is going on that really matters when we understand sex. And what happens in American culture is that we actually value youth to the point where we kind of render sexuality in the elderly as almost invisible, right? Well, interestingly enough, one of the populations which is showing the most rapid increase in sexually transmitted I forgot what the I stands for. Anyways, is the elderly population. That in nursing homes you are finding that there is a spread of STIs very readily. That my son actually worked at a retirement home, and pretty much the residents were getting busy everywhere. Like some of you guys actually work in residence halls, can speak to this. Had a student who worked in the dining hall of a residence, senior residence, and basically he said that one morning they all reported to work to serve breakfast. They walked into the dining hall, and a couple was actually having sex on the dining tables, so they had to postpone breakfast because they had to break everything down, sanitize it, and go on. Now, okay, so sex is everywhere. We are used to portrayals of it, but most of us don't like to think about grandma and grandpa getting it on. So variations in sex, it may be completely approved of. It depends on who is involved and what the situation is. that I argue when it comes to variations in sex and going back to this idea of heterosexism and sexuality, we really do have to challenge why women are taught to be ambivalent about sex. About 10 years ago, I was looking at Halloween pictures from different people, and it was, I think, Rochester clubs. And there was one that, a costume that I kept on seeing young college women wear. And in it, they wore the clothes that they were supposed to go out in. They had their hair done and their makeup done, wearing, their club outfits whatsoever. And they just kind of smeared their makeup a little bit, messed up their hair, put on a big men's shirt over everything, took off their shoes, and the costume was Walk of Shame. And I actually had to have someone explain the Walk of Shame to me, which is this idea that, well, after you have a one-night stand and the woman is going home, it's shameful that they actually call it the Walk of Shame because she did something that she will regret, that there's something to be embarrassed about. My question to you guys then, what is the male equivalent to the Walk of Shame? And there really isn't, right? It is this idea that, well, if a guy has sex, then it's a strut of pride that his male friends will then reward him, kind of, congratulate him even. It's this idea that when it comes to sex, you can't just say it's natural and normal, because presumably if you are, engaged in sex for procreation, then it shouldn't be shameful for either partner. However, in society, then there is stigma for girls having sex or enjoying sex in a way that is not there for men. So when it comes down to it, how we even envision sex then comes from a very sociological perspective. I'm going to end here, and then in the next unit then actually talk about sexuality, sexual identity, and how that plays out.